Chapter 4 of the Mystic Will. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystic Will by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 4. Forethought. Post fata resurgo. What is forethought may sleep, 'tis very plain, but rest assured that it will rise again. Forethought is plan inspired by an absolute will to carry it out. It may have struck the reader as an almost awful, or as a very wonderful idea, that man has within himself, if he did but know it, tremendous powers or transcendental faculties, of which he has really never had any conception. One reason why such bold thought has been subdued is that he has always felt, according to tradition, the existence of superior, supernatural, and with them patrician beings, by whose power and patronage he has been effectively restrained or kept under. Hence gloom and pessimism, doubt and despair. It may seem a bold thing to say that it did not occur to any philosopher through the ages that man, resolute and noble and free, might will himself into a stage of mind defying devils and phantasms, or that amid the infinite possibilities of human nature there was the faculty of assuming the indifference habitual to all animals when not alarmed. But he who will consider these studies on self-hypnotism may possibly infer from them that we have indeed within us a marvelous power of creating states of mind which make the idea of pessimism ridiculous, for it renders potent and grand, pleasing or practically useful to all who practice it, a faculty which has the great advantage that it may enter into all the relations or acts of life, will give to everyone something to do, something to occupy his mind even in itself, and if we have other occupations, forethought and induced will may be made to increase our interest in them and stimulate our skill. In other words, we can, by means of this art, increase our ability to practice all arts, and enhance or stimulate genius in every way or form, be it practical, musical, or plastic. Since I began this work, there fell into my hands an ingenious and curious book entitled Happiness as Found in Forethought minus Fear Thought, by Horace Fletcher, in which the author very truly declares that fear in some form has become the arch enemy of man, and through the fears of our progenitors, developed by 1,000 causes, we have inherited a growing stock of diseases, terrors, apprehensions, pessimisms, and the like, in which he is perfectly right. But, as Mr. Fletcher declares, if men could take forethought as their principle and guide, they would obviate, anticipate, or foresee, and provide for so many evil contingencies and chances that we might secure even peace and happiness, and then man may become brave and genial, altruistic and earnest, in spite of it all, by willing away his timidity. I have not assumed a high philosophical or metaphysical position in this work. My efforts have been confined to indicating how by a very simple and well nigh mechanical process, perfectly intelligible to every human being with an intellect, one may induce certain states of mind, and thereby create a will. But I quite agree with Mr. Fletcher that forethought is strong thought, and the point from which all projects must proceed. As I understand it, it is a kind of impulse or projection of will into the coming work. I may here illustrate this with a curious fact in physics. If the reader wished to ring a doorbell so as to produce as much sound as possible, he would probably pull it as far back as he could and then let it go. But if he would, in letting it go, simply give it a tap with his forefinger, he would actually redouble the noise. Or to shoot an arrow as far as possible, It is not enough to merely draw the bow to its utmost span or tension. If just as it goes you will give the bow a quick push, though the effort be trifling, the arrow will fly almost as far again as it would have done without it. Or if, as it is well known, in wielding a very sharp saber, we make the draw cut, that is, if we add to the blow or chop, as with an axe, a certain slight pull, and simultaneously we can cut through a silk handkerchief or a sheep. Forethought is the tap on the bell, the push of the bow, the draw on the saber. It is the deliberate yet rapid action of the mind when, before falling to sleep or dismissing thought, we bid the mind to subsequently respond. It is more than merely thinking what we are to do. It is the bidding or ordering self to fulfill a task before willing it. Forethought, in the senses employed or implied as here described, means much more than mere previous consideration or reflection, which may be very feeble. It is, in fact, constructive, which, as inventive, implies active thought. Forethought stimulates, aids the success of honest aims. Therefore, as the active principle in mental work, I regard it as a kind of self-impulse, or that minor part in the division of the force implied which sets the major into action. Now, if we really understand this, and can succeed in employing forethought as the preparation for and impulse to self-suggestion, we shall greatly aid the success of the latter, because the former ensures attention and interest. Forethought may be brief, but it should always be energetic. By cultivating it, we acquire the enviable talent of those men who take in everything at a glance and act promptly, like a Napoleon. This power is universally believed to be entirely innate or a gift, but it can be induced or developed in all minds in proportion to the will by practice. Be it observed that as the experimenter progresses in the development of will by suggestion, he can gradually lay aside the latter, or all processes, especially if he work to such an end, anticipating it. Then he simply acts by clear will and strength, and forethought constitutes all his stock in trade, process, or aid. He preconceives and wills energetically at once, and by practice and repetition, forethought becomes a marvelous help on all occasions and emergencies. To make it of avail, the one who frequently practices self-suggestion, at first with and then without sleep, will inevitably find ere long that to facilitate his work, or to succeed, he must first write, as it were, or plan a preface, synopsis, or epitome of his proposed work, to start it and combine with it a resolve or decree that it must be done, the latter being the tap on the bell knob. Now, the habit of composing the plan as perfectly, yet as succinctly as possible, daily or nightly, combined with the energetic impulse to send it off, will ere long give the operator a conception of what I mean by foresight, which by description I cannot. And when grown familiar and really mastered, its possessor will find that his power to think and act promptly in all the emergencies of life has greatly increased. Therefore, forethought means a great deal more, as here employed, than seeing in advance or deliberate prudence. It rather implies, like divination or foreknowledge, sagacity and mental action as well as mere perception. It will inevitably or assuredly grow with the practice of self-suggestion if the latter be devoted to mental improvement. But as it grows, it will qualify the operator to lay aside the sleep and suggest to himself directly. All men of great natural strength of mind, gifted with the will to do and dare, the beings of action and genius, act directly, and are like athletes who lift a tree by the simple exertion of the muscles. He who achieves his aim by self-culture, training, or suggestion is like one who raises the weight by means of a lever, and if he practices often enough, he may in the end become as strong as the other. There is a curious and very illustrative instance of forethought, in the sense in which I am endeavoring to explain it, given in a novel, The Scalp Hunters, by Mayne Reid, with whom I was well acquainted in bygone years. Not having the original, I translate from a French version. His aim with the rifle is infallible, and it would seem as if the ball obeyed his will. There must be a kind of directing principle in his mind, independent of strength of nerve and sight. He and one other are the only men in whom I have observed this singular power. This means simply the exercise in a second, as it were, of the tap on the bell knob, or the projection of the will into the proposed shot, and which may be applied to any act. Gymnasts, leapers, and the like are all familiar with it. It springs from resolute confidence and self-impulse enforced, but it also creates them, and the growth is very great and rapid when the idea is much kept before the mind. In this latter lies most of the problem. In humanity, mind, and especially forethought or reflection, combined in one effort with will and energy, enters into all acts, though often unsuspected, for it is a kind of unconscious reflex action or cerebration. Thus I once discovered to my astonishment in a gymnasium that the extremely mechanical action of putting up a heavy weight from the ground to the shoulder, and from the shoulder to the full reach of the arm above the head, became much easier after a little practice, although my muscles had not grown, nor my strength increased during the time. And I found that whatever the exertion might be, there was always some trick or knack, however indescribable, by means of which the man with a brain could surpass a dolt at anything, though the latter were his equal in strength. But it sometimes happens that the trick can be taught and even improved on, and it is in all cases forethought, even in the lifting of weights, or in the willing on the morrow to write a poem. For this truly weird power, since the weird sisters in Macbeth means only the sisters who foresee, is in fact the energy which projects itself in some manner, which physiology can as yet only very weakly explain, and even if the explanation were perfect, it would amount in fact to no more than showing the machinery of a watch, when the main object for us is that it should keep time and tell the hour, as well as exhibit the ingenuity of the maker, which thing is very much lost sight of even by many very great thinkers, misled by the vanity of showing how much they know. Yes, foresight or forethought projects itself in all things, and it is a serious consideration, or one of such immense value, that when really understood, and above all subjected to some practice, such as I have described, and which, as far as I can see, is necessary, one can bring it to bear intelligently on all the actions of life, that is to say, to much greater advantage than when we use it ignorantly, just as a genius endowed with strength can do far more with it than an ignoramus, for there is nothing requiring thought in which it cannot aid us. I have alluded to poetry. Now, this does not mean that a man can become a Shakespeare or Shelley by means of all the forethought and suggestion in the world, but they will, if well developed and directed, draw out from the mystic depths of mind such talent as he has, doubtless in some or all cases more than he has ever shown. No one can say what is hidden in every memory. It is like the sounding ocean with its buried cities, and treasures and wondrous relics of the olden time. This much we may assume to know, that every image or idea or impression which ever reached us through any of our senses entered a cell when it was ready for it, where it sleeps or wakes, most images being in the former condition. In fact, every brain is like a monastery of the Middle Ages or a beehive, but it is built on a gigantic scale, for it is thought that no man, however learned or experienced he might be, ever contrive during all his life to so much as even half fill the cells of his memory. And if any reader should be apprehensive lest it come to pass with him in this age of unlimited supply of cheap knowledge that he will fill all his cells, let him console himself with the reflection that it is supposed that nature in such a case will have a further supply of new cells ready, she never as yet having failed in such rough hospitality, though it often leaves much to be desired. Yes, they are all there, every image of the past, every face which ever smiled on us, the hopes and fears of bygone years, the rustling of grass and flowers, and the roar of the sea, the sound of trumpets in processions grand, the voices of the great and good among mankind, or what you will. Every line ever read in print, every picture and face and house is there. Many an experiment has shown this to be true. Also that by mesmerizing or hypnotizing processes, the most hidden images or memories can be awakened. In fact, the idea has lost much of its wonder since the time of Coleridge, now that every sound can be recorded, laid away, and reproduced. And we are touching closely on an age when all that lies perdu in any mind can or will be set forth visibly, and all that a man has ever seen be shown to the world. For this is no whit more wonderful than that we can convey images or pictures by telegraph, and when I close my eyes and recall or imagine a form, it does not seem strange that there might be some process by means of which it might be photographed. And here we touch upon the materialization of thought, which conception loses a part of the absurdity with which spiritualists and occultists have invested it. If we regard all nature as one substance, for in truth all that was ever perceived, even to the shadow of a dream by a lunatic, had as real an existence while it lasted as the pyramids of Egypt, else it could not have been perceived. Sense cannot, even in dreams, observe what is not for the time an effect on matter. If a man imagines or makes believe to himself that he has a fairy attendant or a dog, and fancies that he sees it, that man does really see something, though it be invisible to others. There is some kind of creative brain action going on, some employment of atoms and forces, and if this be so, we may enter it among the possibilities of the future, that the material in any form whatever may be advanced or further materialized or made real. It is curious that this idea has long been familiar to believers in magic. In more than one Italian legend which I have collected, a sorceress or goddess evolves a life from her own soul, as a fire emits a spark. In fact, that fancy occurs in some form in all mythologies, great or small. In one old Irish legend, a wizard turns a thought into a watchdog. The history of genius and of invention is that of realizing ideas, of making them clearer and stronger and more comprehensive. Thus it seems to me that the word forethought, as generally loosely understood when compared to what it has been shown capable of expressing, is almost as much advanced as if, like the fairy Hermelina chronicled by Grotius, it had been originally a vapor or mere fantasy, and gradually advanced to fairy life, so as to become the companion of a wizard. If an artist, say a painter, will take forethought for a certain picture, whether the subject be determined or not, bringing himself to that state of easy, assured confidence, as a matter of course, that he will retain the subject, he will, if not at the first effort, almost certainly at last, find himself possessed of it. Let him beware of haste, or of forcing the work. When he shall have secured suggestive interest, let him will that ingenuity shall be bolder, and his spirit draw from the stores of memory more abundant material, and thus our powers may be gradually and gently drawn into our service. Truly, it would seem as if there were no limit to what a man can evolve out of himself if he will take thought thereto. Forethought can be of vast practical use in cases where confidence is required. Many a young clergyman and lawyer has been literally frightened out of a career, and many an actor ruined for want of very little knowledge, and in this I speak from personal experience. Let the aspirant who is to appear in public or pass an examination and is alarmed, base his forethought on such ideas as this: that he would not be afraid to repeat his speech to one person or two. Why should he fear 100? There are some who can repeat this idea to themselves till it takes hold strongly, and they rise almost feeling contempt for all in court, as did the old lady in St. Louis, who felt so relieved when a witness at not feeling frightened that she bade judge and jury cease looking at her in that impudent way. Having read the foregoing to a friend, he asked me whether I believed that by forethought and suggestion a gentleman could be induced without diffidence to offer himself in marriage, since, as is well known, that the most eligible young men often put off wedding for years because they cannot summon up courage to propose. To which I replied that I had no great experience of such cases, but as regarded the method, I was like the Scotch clergyman who, being asked by a wealthy man if he thought that the gift of £1,000 to the kirk would save the donor's soul, replied, "I'm not prepared to precisely answer that question, but I would very warmly advise ye to try it." It must be remembered that for the very great majority of cases, if really not for all, the practicer of this process must be of temperate habits, and never attempt, after a hearty meal or drinking freely, to exercise forethought or self-suggestion. Peaceful mental action during sleep requires that there shall be very light labor of digestion, and disturbed or troublesome dreams are utterly incompatible with really successful results. Nor will a single day's temperance suffice. It requires many days to bring the whole frame and constitution into good fit order. Here there can be no evasion, for more than ordinary temperance in food and drink is absolutely indispensable. It is a principle recognized by all physiologists that digestion and fixed thought cannot go on together. It is even unadvisable to read while eating. Thus, in all the old magical operations, which were in fact self-hypnotism, a perfect fast is insisted on with reason. This is all so self-evident that I need not dwell on it. It will be needless for anyone to take up this subject as a trifling pastime, or attempt self-suggestion and development of will with as little earnestness as one would give to a game of cards. For in such a half-way effort time will be lost and nothing come of it. Unless entered on with the most serious resolve to persevere and make greater effort and more earnestly at every step, it had better be let alone. All who will persevere with calm determination cannot fail ere long to gain a certain success, and this achieved, the second step is much easier. However, there are many people who, after doing all in their power to get to the gold or diamond mines, hasten away even when in the full tide of success, because they are fickle. And it is precisely such people who easily tire, who are most easily attracted, be it to mesmerism, hypnotism, or any other wonder. And they are more wearisome and greater foes to true science than the utterly indifferent or the ignorant. This work will not have been written in vain, should it induce the reader to reflect on what is implied by patient repetition or perseverance, and what an incredible and varied power that man acquires who masters it. He who can lead himself or others into a habit can do anything. Even religion is, in fact, nothing else. Religion, said the reviewer of the Evolution of the Idea of God by Grant Allen, he defines as custom or practice, not theory, not theology, not ethics, not spiritual aspirations, but a certain set of more or less similar observances, propitiation, prayer, praise, offerings, the request for divine favors, the depreciation of divine anger or other misfortunes, in short, ritual. That is to say, it is the aggregate of the different parts of religion, of which many take one for the whole. But this aggregation was the result of earnest patience and had good results. And it is by the careful analysis and all-around examination of ideas that we acquire valuable knowledge, and may learn how very few there are current which are more than very superficially understood, as I have shown in what I have said of the will, the imagination, forethought, and many other faculties which are flippantly used to explain 1,000 problems by people who can hardly define the things themselves. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of the Mystic Will. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roz Mason. The Mystic Will by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 5. Will and Character. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interposed, whose dwelling is all in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things. Wordsworth. As the vast majority of people are not agreed as to what really constitutes a gentleman, while a great many seem to be practically, at least, very much abroad as to the nature of a Christian, so it will be found that, in fact, there is a great deal of difference as regards the will. I have known many men, and some women, to be credited by others, and who very much credited themselves, with having iron wills, when, in fact, their every deed, which was supposed to prove it, was based on brazen want of conscience. Mere want of principle or unscrupulousness passes with many, especially its possessors, for strong will. And even decision of character itself, as McGinn remarks, is often confounded with talent. A bold woman always gets the name of clever among fools, though her intellect may be of a humble order and her knowledge contemptible. Among the vulgar, especially those of greedy, griping race and blood, the children of the thief, a robber of the widow and orphan, the scamp of the syndicate, and soulless promoter in South or North America, bold robbery or selfishness without scruple or timidity always appears as will. But it is not the whole of the real thing, or real will in itself. When Mucius Caius Scaevola thrust his hand into the flames, no one would have greatly admired his endurance if it had been found that the hand was naturally insensible and felt no pain. Nor would there have been any plaudits for Marcus Curtius when he leapt into the gulf, had he been so drunk as not to know what he was about. The will which depends on unscrupulousness is like the benumbed hand or intoxicated soul. Quench conscience as a sense of right and obligation, and you can, of course, do a great deal from which another would shrink, and therefore be called weak-minded by the fools. There is another type of person who imposes on the world and on self as being strong-minded and gifted with will. It is the imperturbable, cool being, always self-possessed, with little sympathy for emotion. In most cases, such minds result from artificial training, and they break down in real trials. I do not say that they cannot weather a storm or a duel, or stand fire, or get through what novelists regard as superlative stage trials, but in a moral crisis, the gentleman or lady whose face is all Corinthian brass is apt, like that brass, in a fire to turn pale. These folk get an immense amount of undeserved admiration as having will or self-command, when they owe what staying quality they have, like the preceding class, rather to a lack of good qualities than their inspiration. There are, alas, not a few who regard will as simply identical with mere obstinacy or stubbornness, the immovability of the ass, or bull, or bear. That is, they reduce it to an animal power. But as this often or generally amounts in animal or man to mere insensible sulkiness, as far remote as possible from enlightened mental action, it is surely unjust to couple it with the voluntary or pure intelligent will, by which all must understand the very acme of active intellect. Therefore it follows that the errors, mistakes, and perversions which have grown about will in popular opinion, like those which have accumulated round Christianity, are too often mistaken for the truth. Pure will is and must be, by its very nature, perfectly free. For the more it is hindered, or hampered, or controlled in any way, the less is it independent volition. Therefore, pure will, free from all restraint, can only act in, or as, moral law. Acting in accordance with very mean, immoral, obstinate motives is, so to speak, obeying, as a slave, the devil. The purer the motive, the purer the will, and in very truth, the purer, the stronger, or firmer. Every man has his own idea of will according to his morality, even as it is said that every man's conception of God is himself infinitely magnified, or, as Sidney Smith declared, that a certain small clergyman believed that St. Paul was 5 feet 2 inches in height and wore a shovel hat. And here we may note that if the fundamental definition of a gentleman be a man of perfect integrity, or one who always does simply what is right, he is also one who possesses will in its integrity. Therefore it follows that if the pure will, which is the basis of all firm and determined action, be a matter of moral conviction, it should take the first place as such. Napoleon I was an exemplar of a selfish, corrupted will, Christ the perfection of will in its purity. And if I can make my meaning clear, I would declare that he who would create within himself a strong and vigorous will by hypnotism or any other process will be most likely to succeed if, instead of aiming at developing a power by which he may subdue others and make all things yield to him, or similar selfish aims, he shall, before all, seriously reflect on how he may use it to do good. For I am absolutely persuaded, from what I know, that he who makes altruism and the happiness of others a familiar thought to be coupled with every effort, even as a lamb is always painted with, or appointed unto St. John, will be the most likely to succeed. There is something in moral conviction or the consciousness of right which gives a sense of security or a faith in success which goes far to secure it. Hence, the willing the mind on the following day to be at peace, not to yield to irritability or temptations to quarrel, to be pleasing and cheerful, in short, to develop good qualities, is the most easily effected process, because where there is such self-moral suasion to a good aim or end, we feel, and very justly, that we ought to be aided by the Deus in nobis, or an overruling providence, whatever its form or nature may be. And the experimenter may be assured that if we can by any means will or exorcise all envy, vanity, folly, irritability, vindictiveness, in short, all evil, out of ourselves, and supply their place with love, we shall take the most effective means to secure our own happiness as well as that of others. All of this has been repeated very often of late years by altruists, but while the doctrine is accepted both by agnostics and Christians as perfect, there has been little done to show men how to practically realize it. But I have ever noted that in this pilgrim's progress of our life, those are most likely to attain to the celestial city and all its golden glories who, like Christian, start from the lowliest beginnings. And as the learning our letters leads to reading the greatest books, so the simplest method of directing the attention and the most mechanical means of developing will may promptly lead to the highest mental and moral effect. Prayer is generally regarded as nothing else but an asking or begging from a superior power. But it is also something which is really very different from this. It is a formula by means of which man realizes his faith and will. Tradition and habit, of whose power I have spoken, or repetition, have given it the influence or prestige of a charm. In fact, it is a spell. He who utters it feels assured that if seriously repeated, it will be listened to, and that the power to whom it is addressed will hear it. The Florentines all round me as I write, who repeat daily, Pater nostro, quis in ciel, sanctificaturie, nome tuum, in words which they do not understand, do not pray for daily bread or anything else in the formula. They only realize that they commune with God and are being good. An intelligent prayer in this light is the concentration of thought on a subject or a definite realization. Therefore, if when willing that tomorrow I shall be calm all day or void of irritation, I put the will or wish into a brief and clear form, it will aid me to promptly realize or feel what I want. And it will be a prayer in its reality, addressed to the unknown power or to the will within us, an invocation or a spell according to the mind of him who makes it. Thus, a seeker may repeat, I will, earnestly and deeply, that during all tomorrow I may be in a calm and peaceful state of mind. I will with all my heart that if irritating or annoying memories or images or thoughts of any kind are in any way awakened, that they may be promptly forgotten and fade away. I would advise that such a formula be got by heart till very familiar, to be repeated, but not mechanically, before falling to sleep. What is of the very utmost importance is that the operator shall feel its meaning and at the same time give it the impulse of will by the dual process before described. This, if successfully achieved, will not fail, at least with most minds, to induce success. This formula or spell will be sufficient for some time. When we feel that it is really beginning to have an effect, we may add to it other wishes. That is to say, be it clearly understood that by repeating the will to be calm and peaceful day after day, it will assuredly begin to come of itself, even as a pigeon which hath been told every day at a certain hour to find corn or crumbs in a certain place, will continue to go there, even if the food cease. However, you may renew the first formula if you will. Then we may add gradually the wish to be in a bold or courageous frame of mind, so as to face trials as follows. I will with all my soul, earnestly and truly, that I may be on the morrow and all the day deeply inspired with courage and energy, with self-confidence and hope. May it lighten my heart and make me heedless of all annoyances and vexations which may arise. Should such come in my way, may I hold them at no more than their real value, or laugh them aside. Proceed gradually and firmly through the series, never trying anything new until the old has fully succeeded. This is essential, for failure leads to discouragement. Then, in time, fully realizing all its deepest meaning, so as to impress the imagination, one may will as follows. May my quickness of perception or intuition aid me in the business which I expect to undertake tomorrow. I will that my faculty of grasping at details and understanding their relations shall be active. May it draw from my memory the hidden things which will aid it. The artist or literary man or poet may in time earnestly will to this effect. I desire that my genius, my imagination, the power which enables man to combine and create, the poetic or artist spirit, whatever it may act in me tomorrow, awakening great thoughts and suggesting for them beautiful forms. He who expects to appear in public as an orator, as a lawyer pleading a case, or as a witness, will do much to win success, if, after careful forethought, or reflecting on what it is that he really wants, he will repeat, I will that tomorrow I may speak or plead with perfect self-possession and absence of all timidity or fear. Finally, we may, after long and earnest reflection on all which I have said, and truly not till then, resolve on the master spell to awaken the will itself in such a form that it will fill our soul, as it were, unto which intent it is necessary to understand what will really means to us in its purity and integrity. The formula may be, I will that I may feel inspired with the power, aided by calm determination, to do what I desire, aided by a sense of right and justice to all. May my will be strong and sustain me in all trials. May it inspire that sense of independence of strength which, allied to a pure conscience, is the greatest source of happiness on earth. If the reader can master this last, he can by its aid progress infinitely, and with the few spells which I have given he will need no more, since in these lie the knowledge and key and suggestion to all which may be required. Now it will appear clearly to most that no man can long and steadily occupy himself with such pursuits without morally benefiting by them in his waking hours, even if auto-hypnotism were all mere imagination in the most frivolous sense of the word. For he who will himself not to yield to irritability can hardly avoid paying attention to the subject and thinking thereon, check himself when vexed. And, as I have said, what we summon by will ere long remains as habit, even as the elves, called by a spell, remain in the tower. Therefore it is of great importance for all people who take up and pursue to any degree of success this art or science, that they shall be actuated by moral and unselfish motives, since achieved with any other intent, the end can only be the bringing of evil and suffering into the soul. For as the good, by strengthening the will, make themselves promptly better and holier, so he who increases it merely to make others feel his power will become with it wickeder, yea, and thrice accursed. For what is the greatest remedy is often the strongest poison. Step by step, science has advanced of late to the declaration that man thinks all over his body, or at least experiences those reflected sensations or emotions which are so strangely balanced between intellectual sense and sensation that we hardly know where or how to class them. The sensitive plexi of our whole organism are all either isolated or thrown into simultaneous vibration when acted on by thought. So the will may be found acting unconsciously as an emotion or instinct, or developed with the highest forms of conscious reflection. Last of all, we find it probably as the result of all associated functions or powers, at the head of all, their executive president. But is it the exponent of correlated forces? There indeed doctors differ. There is a very curious Italian verb, invogliare, which is thus described in a dictionary of idioms. Invogliare is to inspire a will or desire, cupiditatem injicere a movere, To invogliare anyone is to awake in him the will or the ability or capacity, an earnest longing or appetite, an ardent wish, alicuius re cupiditatem a desiderium aligni movere, to bring into action a man's hankering, solicitude, anxiety, yearning, ardor, predilection, love, fondness and relish, or aught which savors of willing. Our English word, inveigle, is derived from it, but we have none precisely corresponding to it which so generally sets forth the idea of inspiring a will in another person. Suggestion is far more general and vague. Now, if a man could thus in-will himself to good or moral purpose, he would assume a new position in life. We all admit that most human beings have defects or faults of which they would gladly be freed, however incorrigible they appear to be, but they have not the patience to effect a cure, to keep to the resolve, or prevent it from fading out of sight. For a vast proportion of all minor sins, or those within the law, there is no cure sought. The offender says and believes, "It is too strong for me." And yet these small, unpunished offenses cause 1,000 times more suffering than all the great crimes. Within a generation, owing to the great increase of population, prosperity, and personal comfort, nervous susceptibility has also gained in extent. But there has been no check to petty abuse of power, selfishness, which always comes out in some form of injustice or wrong, or similar vexations. Nay, what with the disproportionate growth of vulgar wealth, this element has rapidly increased, and it would really seem as if the plague must spread ad infinitum, unless some means can be found to invogliare and inspire the offenders with a sense of their sins and move them to reform. And it is more than probable that if all who are at heart sincerely willing to reform their morals and manners could be brought to keep their delinquencies before their consciousness in the very simple manner which I have indicated, the fashion or mode might at least be inaugurated. For it is not so much a moral conviction or an appeal to common sense which is needed, as writers on ethics all seem to think, but some practical art of keeping men up to the mark in endeavoring to reform, or to make them remember it all day long, since out of sight, out of mind, is the devil's greatest help with weak minds. End of chapter 5. Recording by Roz Mason in Portland, Oregon. rozmason.com, RAZMASON.com.
Chapter 6 of The Mystic Will. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystic Will by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 6. Suggestion and Instinct. Anima non nascitur sed fit, ut et. Tertullianus. Postquam liquiti sumista anima rationali, intellectuali, immortali, et quia ad inferiores descendimus iam gradus anime. Silicet anime mortalis, quae animalium est. Petrus Gregorius Tholosanus. It must have struck many readers that the action of a mind under hypnotic influence, be it of another or of self, involves strange questions as regards consciousness. For it is very evident from recorded facts that people can actually reason and act without waking consciousness, in a state of mind which resembles instinct, which is a kind of cerebration, or acting under habits and impressions supplied by memory and formed by practice, but not according to what we understand by reason or judgment. All things in nature have their sleep or rest. Night is the sleep of the world, death the repose of nature or life. The solid temples, the great globe itself, dissolve to awaken again. So man hath in him, as it were, a company of workmen, some of whom labour by day, while others watch by night, during which time they, unseen, have their fantastic frolics known as dreams. The guardian or master of the daily hours appears in a great measure to conform his action closely to average duties of life, in accordance with those of all other men. He picks out from the millions of images or ideas in the memory, uses and becomes familiar with a certain number, and lets the rest sleep. This master or active agent is probably himself a master idea, the result of the correlative action of all the others, a kind of consensus made personal, an elected queen bee, as I have otherwise described him or her. But he is not the only thinker. There are all over the body ganglions which act as a kind of fluid instinct, born of repetition, and when the tired master even drowses or nods or falls into a brown study, then a marvellously curious mental action begins to show itself, for dreams at once flicker and peer and steal dimly about him. This is because the waking consciousness is beginning to shut out the world and its set of ideas. So consistent is the system that even if waking reason abstract itself, not to sleep, but to think on one subject, such as writing a poem or inventing a machine, certain affinities will sleep or dreams begin to show themselves. When genius is really at work, it sweeps along as it were in a current, albeit it has enough reason left to also use the rudder and oars or spread and manage a sail. The reason for the greater fullness of unusual images and associations, i.e. the action of genius, during the time when one is bent on intellectual invention, is that the more the waking consciousness, reason, drowses or approaches to sleep, the more do many images in memory awaken and begin to shyly open the doors of their cells and peep out. In the dream we also proceed, or rather drift, loosely on a current, but are without oars, rudder, or sail. We are hurtled against or hurried away from the islands of images or ideas, that is to say, all kinds of memories, and our course is managed or impelled or guided by tricky water sprites, whose minds are all on mischief bent, or only idle merriment. In any case they conduct us blindly and wildly from isle to isle, sometimes obeying a far cry which comes to them through the mist, some echoing signal of our waking hours, so in a vision ever on we go. That is to say that even while we dream there is an unconscious cerebration or voluntarily exerted power loosely and irregularly imitating by habit something like the action of our waking hours, especially its brown studies and fancies in drowsy reveries or play. It seems to me as if this sleep master or mistress, I prefer the latter, who attends to our dreams, may be regarded as instinct on the loose, for like instinct she acts without conscious reasoning. She carries out or realizes trains of thought or sequences with little comparison or deduction. Yet within her limits she can do great work, and when we consider, we shall find that by following mere law she has effected a great, nay, an immense deal, which we attribute entirely to forethought or reason. As all this is closely allied to the action of the mind when hypnotized, it deserves further study. Now it is a wonderful reflection that as we go back in animated nature from man to insects, we find self conscious intellect or reason based on reflection disappear, and instinct taking its place. Yet instinct in its marvelous results, such as ingenuity or adaptation, often far surpasses what semi civilized man could do. Or it does the same things as man, only in an entirely different way which is not as yet understood. Only from time to time someone tells a wonderful story of a bird, a cat, or a dog, and then asks, "Was not this reason?" What it was, in a great measure, was an unconscious application of memory or experience. Bees and ants and birds often far outdo savage men in ingenuity of construction. The Red Indians, in their persistent use of flimsy, cheerless bark wigwams, were far behind the beaver or oriole as regards dwellings. In this respect the Indian indicated mere instinct of a low order, as all do who live in circles of mere tradition. Now to advance what seems a paradox. It is evident that even what we regard as inspired genius comes to man in a great measure from instinct, though, as I have noted before, it is aided by reflection. As the young bird listens to its mother and then sings till as a grown nightingale, it pours forth a rich flood of varying melody, so the poet or musician follows masters and models, and then, like them, creates, often progressing, but is never entirely spontaneous or original. When the artist thinks too little he lacks sense; when he thinks too much he loses fire. In the very highest and most strangely mysterious poetical flights of Shelley and Keats or Wordsworth, I find the very same instinct which inspires the skylark and nightingale, but more or less allied to and strengthened by thought or consciousness. If human will or wisdom alone directed all our work, then every man who had mere patience might be a great original genius, and it is indeed true that man can do inconceivably more in following and imitating genius than has ever been imagined. However, thus far the only talent which enables a man to write such a passage as that of Tennyson, "The tides of music's golden sea setting towards eternity," results from a development of instinct, or an intuitive perception of the beautiful, such as Wordsworth believed existed in all things which enjoy sunshine, life, and air. The poet himself cannot explain the processes, though he may be able to analyze in detail how or why he made or found 1,000 other things. It is not only true that genius originates in something antecedent to conscious reflection or intellect, but also that men have produced marvellous works of art almost without knowing it, while others have shown the greatest incapacity to do so after they have developed an incredible amount of knowledge. Thus Mr. Whistler reminded Ruskin that when the world had its greatest artists there were no critics. And it is well to remember that while the Greeks in all their glory of art and poetry were unquestionably rational or consciously intelligent, there was not among them the thousandth part of the anxious worrying, the sentimental self seeking and examination, or the introversion which worms itself in and out of and through all modern work. Action and thought, even as mercury in an air pump, will permeate the hardest wood. For the Greeks worked more in the spirit of instinct, that is, more according to certain transmitted laws and ideas, than we realize, albeit this tradition was of a very high order. We have lost art because we have not developed tradition, but have immensely increased consciousness or reflection out of proportion to art. It was from India and Egypt in a positive form that man drew the poison of sentimental egoism, which became comparative in the Middle Ages and superlative in this our time. It is very evident that as soon as men became self conscious of great work, or ceased to work for the sake of enjoying art or its results, and turned all their attention to the genius or cleverness or character of style, self, etc., of the artist, or of themselves, a decadence sets in, as there did after the Renaissance, when knowledge or enjoyment of art was limited, and guided by familiarity with names and schools and manners or the like, far more than by real beauty in itself. Now, out of all of this which I have said on art, strange conclusions may be drawn. The first being that even without self conscious thought or excess of intellect, there can be a sense of enjoyment in any or every organism, also a further development of memory or that enjoyment, and finally a creation of buildings, music and song, with no reflection in animals and very little in man. And when man gets beyond working with simple nature and begins to think chiefly about himself, his art, as regards harmony with nature, deteriorates. We do not sufficiently reflect on the fact that natura naturans, or the action of nature, or simply following tradition, may, as is the case of transition architecture, involve the creation of marvellously ingenious and beautiful works, and the great enjoyment of them by instinct alone. It is not possible for ordinary man to even understand this now in all its fullness. He is indeed trying to do so, but it is too new for his comprehension. But a time will come when he will perceive that his best work has been done unconsciously or under influences of which he was ignorant. Hypnotism acts entirely by suggestion, and he who paints or does other work entirely according to tradition, also carries out what is or has been suggested to him. Men of earlier times, who thus worked for thousands of years like the Egyptians in one style, were guided by the faith that it had been begun by the Creator or God. For men cannot conceive of creation as separate from predetermined plan or end, and all because they cannot understand that creative innate force, potentia, must have some result, or that the simplest law once set a going awakens, acquires strength in going, and develops great laws, which, with an all susceptible or capable material to work on, may or must create infinite ingenuities, so that in time there may be an organic principle with sentiency and yet no will, save in its exponents or working to end or aim, but ever tending to further unfolding, a seizing and giving the fire of the living, ever onwards into eternity, in which there may be a million times more perfect mind than we can now grasp. Now, having for many years attempted at least to familiarize myself with the aspect or sound of this problem, though I could not solve it, it seems at last to be natural enough that even matter, which so many persist in regarding as a kind of dust or something resistant to the touch, but which I regard as infinite millions of degrees more subtle, may think just as well as it may act in instinct. It is indeed absurd to admit souls to idiots or savages who have not the sense to live as comfortably as many animals, and yet deny it to the latter. When we really become familiar with the idea, it appears sensible enough, but its opponents do not become familiar with it. It irritates them. They call it atheistic, although it is nothing of the kind, just as if it were to say that a man who bravely and nobly pursued his way in life, doing his duty because it was his duty, and giving no thought as to future reward or punishment, must needs want soul, or be an atheist. If all men were perfectly good, they would act morally and instinctively, without consciousness of behaving well, and if we felt a high ideal of art, it would be just the same. When art was natural, men never signed their names to their work, but now the name takes precedence of the picture. Therefore, as we go backward into the night of things, we find, though we forget it all the time, that instinct, or the living in the spirit of law, had its stars or planets which shone more brilliantly than now, at least in faith. Thus there are two sources of creation or action, both based on evolution, one being unconscious and guided by natural law, and the other which is conscious and grows out of the first. Hence cognito ergo sum, which well nigh all men really understand as cogito ergo sum Deus, or we may say that they assume because I think, then God must think like me. Now to come to hypnotic thought or suggested mental action. I would infer that, according to what I have said, there may be two kinds of mentality or working of the mind, the one under certain conditions as effective or resultant as the other, the first being, as it was in the order of time, unconscious or instinctive, the other conscious and self-observant. For the man who built a Romanesque cathedral worked by the suggestiveness of minds which went before him, or tradition. He was truly, as it were, in a kind of slumber. Indeed, all life was more or less of a waking dream in those dim, strange days. Millions marched forth to death, scarce knowing why. All because they were told to do so. They felt that they must do it, and they did. Like turkeys led by a red rag, says Carlyle. And the red rag and the turkey is an illustration of hypnotism in one of the books thereon. Instinct is hypnotism. Now I have found that by suggesting to oneself before sleep, or inducing self by will or forethought to work gladly and unweariedly the next day, we do not think about self or the quality of what we do to any degree like what we would in working under ordinary conditions. Truly it is not thorough going or infallible in all cases, but then it must be helped by a little wide awake self conscious will. But this is certainly true, that we can turn out better work when we urge our creative power to awake in the morn and act or aid, than if we do not. For there are many angels at our call, and many blessed spirits who are bound to lend their aid in every strait and turn, and elves to fly the errands of the soul, and fairies all too glad to give us help, if we but know how to pronounce the spell which calls them unto us in every need. That spell I have shown or explained clearly enough. And finally, to recapitulate, instinct in its earlier or simpler form is the following laws of nature, which are themselves formed by motive laws. In man the living, according to tradition, is instinct of a higher order, and the one or the other is merely being ruled by suggestion. The more free will is developed and guided by reflection, or varied tradition and experience, the less instinct and the more intellect will there be. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Of the Mystic Will. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystic Will by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 7. Memory Culture. 'Twas wisely said by Plato, when he called memory the mother of the intellect, for knowledge is to wisdom what his realm is to a monarch, that o'er which he rules, and he who hath the will can ever win such empire to himself. Will can do all. There is nothing in which the might of the will can be so clearly set forth as in the making of memory. By means of it, as is fully proved by millions of examples, man can render his power of recollection almost infinite. And lest the reader may think that I here exaggerate, I distinctly assert that I never knew a man of science, familiar with certain facts which I shall repeat, who ever denied its literal truth. As I have already stated, there are two methods, and only two, by means of which we can retain images, facts, or ideas. One of these is that which in many varied forms, which are all the same in fact, is described in the old Artis Memorandi, or Arts of Memory. There are several hundreds of these, and to the present day there are professors who give instructions according to systems of the same kind. These are all extremely plausible, being based on the association of ideas, and in most cases the pupil makes great progress for a short time. Thus we can remember the French for bread, pain, Italian pane, by thinking of the pan in which bread is baked, or the difficult name of the inventor, Sheepanic, by thinking of a crowd of frightened women, and which I remembered by the fact that pain is the Slavonian for Mr. or Sir. for there is such a tendency of ideas to agglutinate, and so become more prominent, as we can see two bubbles together in a pool more readily than one, that we can very soon learn to recall many images in this way. But after a time a certain limit is reached which most minds cannot transgress. Volapük was easy so long as, like Pidgin English, it contained only a few hundred words and no grammar, but now that it is a dictionary of 4,000 terms and a complete grammar, it is as hard to learn as Spanish. It invariably comes to pass in learning to remember by the associative method that after a time images are referred to images, and these to others again, so that they form entire categories in which the most vigorous mind gets lost. The other method is that of direct memory guided by will, in which no regard is paid to association, especially in the beginning. Thus to remember anything, or rather to learn how to do so, we take something that is very easy to retain, the easier the better, be it a jingling nursery rhyme, a proverb, or a text. Let this be learned to perfection backwards and forwards, or by permutation of words, and repeated the next day. Note that the repetition or reviewing is of more importance than aught else. On the second day add another proverb or verse to the preceding, and so on, day by day, always reviewing and never learning another syllable until you are sure that you perfectly or most familiarly retain all that you have memorized. The result will be, if you persevere, that before long you will begin to find it easier to remember anything. This is markedly the case as regards the practice of reviewing, which is invariably hard at first, but which becomes, ere long, habitual and then easy. I cannot impress it too vividly on the mind of the reader that he cannot make his exercises too easy. If he finds that 10 lines a day are too much, let him reduce them to 5, or 2, or 1, or even a single word, but learn that, and persevere. When the memory begins to improve under this process, the tasks may of course be gradually increased. An uncle of the present Khedive of Egypt told me that when he was learning English he at first committed to memory 50 words a day, but soon felt himself compelled to very much reduce the number in order to permanently remember what he acquired. One should never overdrive a willing horse. Where there is a teacher with youthful pupils, he can greatly aid the process of mere memorizing by explaining the text, putting questions as to its meaning, or otherwise awakening an interest in it. After a time the pupils may proceed to verbal memorizing, which consists of having the text simply read or repeated to them. In this way, after a year or 18 months of practice, most people can actually remember a sermon or lecture word for word. This was the process which was discovered, I may say simultaneously, by David Kay and myself, as our books upon it appeared at almost the same time. But since then I have modified my plan and made it infinitely easier and far more valuable, as will be apparent to all by the application of the principles laid down in this book. For while, according to the original views, memory depended on will and perseverance, there was no method indicated by any writer how these were to be created, nor was energetic forethought considered as amounting to more than mere intention. Now I would say that having the task selected, first give energetic forethought, or a considerate determination. To master this should precede all attempts to learn, by everybody, young or old. And when the lesson is mastered, let it be repeated with earnestness and serious attention before going to sleep, with the will that it shall be remembered on the morrow. And it will be found that this process not only secures the memory desired, but also greatly facilitates the whole course and process. It is to be noted that by this or any process we do not remember everything, but only what is first considered and measured by forethought. Also that by it the memory is never overcharged at the expense of intellect, for the exertion of will in any way strengthens the mind. To explain the immense power which this all implies, I observe that previous to the invention of printing, it was usual for students to get their text books by heart. Thus in India, according to Max Muller, the entire text and glosses of Panini's Sanskrit grammar were handed down orally for 350 years before being committed to writing. This work is equal in size to the Bible. There are Indian priests now living who can repeat accurately the whole poems of the Mahabharata of 3,000 slokas, or lines. That these incredible feats were the result of a system of memorizing similar to what I have explained. That the Guzlas or Slavonian minstrels of the present day have by heart, with remarkable accuracy, immensely long epic poems. I have found the same among Algonquin Indians, whose sagas, or mythic legends, are interminable, and yet are committed word by word accurately. I have heard in England of a lady 90 years of age whose memory was miraculous, and of which extraordinary instances are narrated by her friends. She attributed it to the fact that when young she had been made to learn a verse from the Bible every day, and then constantly review it. As her memory improved she learned more, the result being that in the end she could repeat from memory any verse or chapter called for in the whole Scripture. The habit had marvellously developed her intelligence as well as memory. Now I confidently declare that if this lady had submitted what she learned to the suggestive will process, she could have spared herself half the labor. And it is to be observed that as in the time the labor of reviewing and the faculty of promptly recalling becomes easier and easier till it is simply mechanical, so the memorizing by suggestion becomes more facile until it is, so to speak, only a form. And as it becomes easier, the foresight strengthens till it wields an absolute power. If the reader is interested in this subject of developing the memory, I would refer him to my work on Practical Education, in which it is discussed with reference to recalling objects through all the senses. No one who has made even a very slight trial of the process of impressing on the mind before sleep something which must be remembered, can fail to be convinced ere long of the truth that there is in it a marvellous power which will, with easy and continued practice, enable him to recall whatever he pleases. It follows as a matter of course that this would be of incredible value in education, but notwithstanding the vast discussion of this subject which is ever going on, it does not seem to occur to a living man that we should develop and train the mental faculties, such as memory and quickness of perception, as well as set them to hard work. It is also safe to say that there is not a man living who was educated from boyhood upon this principle, and yet I am confident that no scientist in existence, knowing the facts on which my statement is based, will deny that it is as easy to develop the mental factors alluded to as to learn a language or play on the piano. It is not a matter of theory but of facts. Millions of men have in the past acquired the faculty of being able to repeat and remember whatever they heard, if they earnestly attended to it. Earnest attention in this case means a strong exercise of forethought, or determination to an end of given purpose. In Iceland, that which has since become the English common law was at an early date very fully developed, without any books or writing, and there were lawyers who had by heart all the laws and incredible numbers of precedents, as appears from several sagas, among others that of the Burnt Njal. Our present system of education is that of building houses without foundations. No one suspects or dreams what mighty powers there are latent in us all, or how easily they may be developed. It would not be so reprehensible if men entirely neglected the subject, but they are always working hard and spending millions on the old system, and will not even make the least experiment to test a new theory. One reason for this is the old belief that we are all born with a certain quantum of gifts, as for example memory, capacity, patience, etc., all more or less limited, and in reality not to be enlarged or improved. The idea is natural, because we see that there are very great differences, hereditary or otherwise, in children. But it is false. So we go to work to fill up the quantum of memory as soon as possible by violent cramming, and in like manner tax to the utmost all the mental faculties without making the least effort to prepare, enlarge, or strengthen them. I shall not live to see it, but a time will come when this preparation of the mental faculties will be regarded as the basis of all education. To recapitulate in a few words: when we desire to fix anything in the memory, we can do so by repeating it to ourselves before we go to sleep, accompanying it with the resolution to remember it in the future. We must not in the beginning set ourselves any but very easy tasks, and the practice must be steadily continued. It has been often said that a perfect memory is less of a blessing than the power of oblivion. Thus Themistocles, who, according to Cato, as cited by Cicero, knew the names and faces of every man in Athens, having offered to teach some one the art of memory, received for reply, "Rather teach me how to forget. Esse factorum, si se oblivisci, quae velit, quam si meminisse docuisset." And Claudius had such an enviable power in the latter respect, that immediately after he had put to death his wife Messalina, he forgot all about it, asking, "Cur domina von venerit?" why the missus didn't come; while on the following day, after condemning several friends to death, he sent invitations to them to come and dine with him. And again, there are people who have, as it were, two memories, one good, the other bad, as was the case with Calvisius Sabrinus, who could recall anything in literature, but never remembered the names of his own servants, or even his friends. But he got over the difficulty by naming his 9 attendants after the 9 Muses, while he called his intimates Homer, Hesiod, and so on. This scholar would truly seem to have drunk of the 2 fountains sacred to Trophonius by the river Orchomenus in Boeotia, one of which bestowed memory and the other oblivion. And like unto them is the power of the will, aided by forethought and suggestion. For while it properly directs and aids us to remember what we will, it per contra also helps us to forget. End of chapter 7.